Okay, so we should be linked up to Facebook now and recording here in our debrief room. And thanks, folks who are waiting in the waiting room to join us and to tune into this open meeting debrief that we're hosting today. We're going to try to leave time at the end of our conversation for questions if you have any. So feel free to stick around for that time or use the chat to drop questions you might have. And I guess we'll do introductions. I'm SJ with Commission Shift. I'm joined by our Executive Director, Virginia Palacios. And Virginia was at the open meeting today, and we're here to talk about these monthly open meetings that our oil and gas agency hosts. These open meetings typically last about 30 minutes. Today's was 36 minutes long and had nearly 400 agenda items. It's a lot to cover in that short amount of time. So we're going to sort of slow it down, break it down, and explain what some of these agenda items are and how they matter to the rest of us Texans. And Virginia, you know a lot about oil and gas. I know a little bit about oil and gas. So I'm going to kick it off to you to give us an overview. A lot of the agenda items today had to do with orphaned and inactive wells. Can you talk us through those items that we were looking at, why we care about inactive wells, and what happens when we have, in today's case, 392 wells owned by 28 companies that are out of compliance?
Sure. So, in every Railroad Commission open meeting agenda, they're kind of cycling through different phases of an enforcement process with operators that have these inactive wells. So, a well becomes inactive if it stops producing below up to a threshold amount that makes the well active. It's pretty low. I think it's like for oil wells, it's like 1 barrel for 3 consecutive months. And then for gas wells, it might be 10,000 cubic feet per day for 3 consecutive months. So it's a pretty like small amount that they have to be producing to be considered active. But if they fall below that threshold, they become inactive. Um, and once they're inactive for 12 months, that's when the operator is supposed to plug their well. But if they don't want to plug their well, they can go to the Railroad Commission and ask for a plugging extension. There's different things they can do to be able to get a plugging extension. They could put up an additional bond on their wells. They could prove that they have plugged another 10% of their overall well population. Um, and there's a couple other things that they could do. They could just have kind of like their bank vouch for them and say that they have a letter of credit. So some things that they do like don't even cost any additional extra money. But if they don't do any of these things, if they don't remove equipment from the surface or plug the well or ask for a plugging extension, then the Railroad Commission will not allow them to renew their P5. The P5 is a document that simply like registers the company with the commission, but if you don't have it, then you can't operate in the state of Texas. And so if so one of the first things that we see on the Railroad Commission agendas is non-compliance with Rule 15 inactive well items. And so this is kind of the first slap on the wrist where the Railroad Commission says, hey, you haven't plugged your wells, you haven't gotten a plugging extension, you're going to lose your ability to operate. At that point, the operators can then request a hearing from the Railroad Commission. And that's where we see this stuff kind of come up in a different part of the agenda where the Railroad Commission assesses whether the operator had some kind of good reason for not plugging their wells. And and actually, I should phrase that differently because what we saw on the agenda today was a set of cases where the Railroad Commission said, we don't care what your excuse was for not complying with this rule. You could have provided evidence to show us that you did comply with the rule and we were mistaken. But because you showed us evidence that you just had a bad excuse for not complying with the rule, we're not going to let you renew your P5. And so it was good to see the Railroad Commission kind of ruling that way. They're setting a firm line and saying, like, the law says you have to do this. You can't just come in and say, sorry, I submitted my form a day late, or like, I didn't know what the rules were or something like that. Like you have to comply with the law. And so um, what happens then is if these inactive wells are not economically viable, if another operator can't come and take these inactive wells and get them to produce again, then they will likely be orphaned. And so they're going to go on the Railroad Commission's orphaned wells list, and then the state is going to have to pay to plug those wells at some point.
I think that kind of answers my next question I had, which is why do we care about growing numbers of inactive wells? I think we've talked about orphan wells before and the risks that they pose, and that number is growing. Are you also seeing inactive well numbers growing? I mean, they have to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say when I started doing all this work 5 years ago, there was about 130,000 inactive wells on the list, and today there's around 155,000. And so, operators are drilling more new wells every day. Wells are becoming inactive every day, and so that population is growing if the operators aren't going back and plugging the wells at the same rate that new wells are coming on. And we know that operators plug around 7,700 wells per year on average. The Railroad Commission has been plugging around 1,300 wells per year on average. And so operators are plugging the vast majority of wells in Texas. But at these rates, it's still not fast enough to really keep up with the growing number of inactive wells and the growing number of orphaned wells.
So we recently, well, I guess not recently anymore, in the last legislative session in 2025, there was a law that was passed called Senate Bill 1150. And this is an inactive well plugging rule. Can you tell us what is in this rule and why that might be relevant now?
Sure. And so before SB 1150, operator, and still today, really, because the law has not been implemented yet, it hasn't gone into effect yet. Um, Operators can apply for plugging extensions on their inactive wells pretty much indefinitely. And so they can just go year after year and continue to extend when they are going to have to plug that well. And so that means that there's really not a plugging requirement if you can delay plugging indefinitely. Um, and so that's what's causing the pileup of orphaned wells in the state that is very expensive to keep up with. It's resulting a lot of leaking wells, and guys are like well blowouts and all kinds of problems. And so SB 1150 puts a timeline on when operators will have to plug their inactive wells. And so for inactive wells that have been inactive for at least 15 years and are 25 years old, they will have to go to the Railroad Commission and submit a compliance plan. And the compliance plan will tell the Railroad Commission that they plan to plug or reactivate their wells by 2042. So it should come up with some kind of timeline on which they're going to do that. If they decide that they don't want to ask for a compliance plan, there's three other options that they have to be able to get a plugging extension. We don't like this. They read to us as loopholes that will allow operators to continue to kick the can down the road indefinitely. But they can claim that they have financial hardship. They can submit an additional bond on the well. Admittedly, that option might be difficult to get because if you're a surety company that issues bonds, then an older well seems like a riskier business decision. So it's possible there might not be that many companies offering these. Um, and then the last option is that you can show that you are a company that has a history of reactivating wells. Almost every oil and gas company has a history of reactivating wells. So we're really hoping that the Railroad Commission puts uh, some clear requirements around those three options and doesn't just make it a free for all for companies to continue getting plugging extensions forever and ever. Um, if SB 1150 is done correctly, and if those plugging extensions are only offered in a limited fashion, then it will mean that all inactive wells will be plugged in the next 15 years, ostensibly. And so everybody's going to kind of be on this cycle, and there won't be any wells really that are like outside of that requirement. And so it could be really good for the state. What we're going to get into, though, is this situation where there are a lot of oil and gas operators that have been counting on the fact that they would never have to plug their wells. So they have not been setting money aside to plug their wells. And now that they're going to be required to plug their wells, they will probably go bankrupt because they never had the money to be able to do it in the first place. And so we might see a lot more well orphaning in the beginning when SB 1150 goes into effect.
Okay, so SB 1150 passed by the legislature, enforced by the Railroad Commission, implemented by the Railroad Commission, and at the current stage that it's in right now, there's a lot of potential loopholes for how it would be enforced or how operators would comply. Um, is that the way things are, Virginia, or what do we do about when we see these potential loopholes? What are the pathways for action here?
Well, so we're still in the rulemaking process at the Railroad Commission, and then the bill won't go into effect until 2027. And so we're expecting the rule to be proposed, a draft rule to be proposed by the Railroad Commission in the fall this year, and then there will be a public comment period. Commission Shift has already been meeting with different experts and impacted community members to come up with recommendations for the Railroad Commission in writing this rule. And so we're putting a lot of thought into what needs to be done to make this a rule that is effective and does what it is intended to do, which is protect groundwater and make sure that operators pay for their liabilities, not the public.
Awesome. So, if folks that tune into this debrief are following us on social media or signing up for Commission Ship's newsletter, you will see opportunities as we get closer to the public rulemaking to sign on to public comments, to show up to a hearing and have your voice heard. And we'll be flagging opportunities like that as we get closer. Virginia, when is the rulemaking? About what time are we expecting that to happen?
It has to be completed by December 31st, 2026. And so we're expecting that it'll be proposed sometime around September, but we don't have an official date yet.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so another part of the agenda that stood out today was there was an update on the endangerment finding, which is sort of at the federal level. Some things that have been happening, you may have seen headlines about this, that the EPA is repealing the endangerment finding. Maybe Virginia, you could kind of give us a summary of what is the endangerment finding and how does that relate maybe to emissions in Texas?
So the endangerment finding was a 2009 decision by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that found that greenhouse gases that warm the planet are in fact creating dangers to the public, right? And so it acknowledged that the extreme weather that is caused by climate change endangers human health and safety, among other problems that can be caused by climate change. I think one thing that a lot of people don't know about is that this warming of the climate and the lack of freezes that take place in places like Texas, right, because of global warming, results in more pests and more vectors for disease. Animals like rats or mosquitoes can transmit disease at a greater rate. That's just one of the things that can affect our public health, one of those public health impacts of climate change. And so the EPA considered things like this, and they said, you know what? We do have the authority to regulate greenhouse gases because they create this danger to human health and safety. And so while the EPA did not enact significant restrictions on greenhouse gas emissions at that point in time. They just kind of laid the groundwork to do it in the future. What did end up happening later on was that they required operators who emit greenhouse gases to report their emissions to the EPA. So that was called the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule. And so we have recently seen the Trump administration roll back the greenhouse gas reporting rule, which is not a good thing because right now there's actually a high demand from European nations for natural gas, but they want to see how high our emission rates are, right? Because European nations are actually trying to do something about their greenhouse gases. And so the fact that we don't have any data to be able to prove to them what's actually going on is not good for business. It's not good for the state if we want to be exporting natural gas. But more importantly, if you want to make claims that greenhouse gases are or are not impacting the climate, you can't do that unless you have the data. And so repealing the greenhouse gas reporting rule was not a good move. And then repealing the endangerment finding just means that the public is set up to be even more impacted by greenhouse gases in the future because we won't have a legal way to restrict greenhouse gases from emitting sources. Um, and so, Texas is the highest greenhouse gas emitting state in the country. We also produce more oil and gas than any other state. And so these are important things to us. One of the rules that is also in play and that we're expecting to see repealed by the Trump administration is the methane rule, right? And so the methane rule would require oil and gas operators to find and fix methane leaks on their systems. One really important part of the methane rule is that it was going to eliminate routine venting and flaring by a certain date. It was going to require operators to actually capture that gas and do something with it. And so that anticipated repeal of the methane rule is something that is bad for Texans because it increases the impacts of global warming. Ironically, there has been some discussion in the news that the methane rule may actually complicate the EPA's repeal of the endangerment finding. And I know, although that repeal decision was finalized, there have been appeals that have already been filed. And so because Congress passed the IRA, which included the methane bill, Congress has already taken an action to say that greenhouse gases should be regulated. But the endangerment finding repeal was sort of making the argument that Congress has never acted on greenhouse gases, which is not true. And so that's probably way too much legalese. There's a lot of little kind of things at play and little strategies at play. And, we'll kind of see where the chips fall at the end of the day.
Yeah, and maybe also though it's helpful to kind of share, we know that there's impacts with like methane contributing to climate change. Can you also speak to local impacts of emissions like methane
Well,
or other
so,
kinds of venting and flaring emissions?
oh yeah. And so, the methane rule would have regulated venting and flaring as a source of methane emissions. Methane typically isn't directly harmful to human health, other than that it creates climate change, and climate change is harmful to human health. But there are a number of other emissions that come from venting and flaring that are very harmful to human health. You can have ozone precursors like nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides that mix in sunlight to create ozone. And ozone is really harmful to respiratory health and can cause lots of health problems. You also can get volatile organic compounds that are carcinogenic and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that can cause other types of organ problems and things like that. And so There also have been studies showing that women who live next to high rates of flaring in the Eagleford Shale have 50% higher odds of preterm birth. There was a study from Clean Air Task Force showing higher risk of cancer rates in areas that have a lot of oil and gas development. And so there's a number of public health concerns that are related to venting and flaring, and we really need to get those activities under control.
And maybe we should just segue into your public input that you gave today at the meeting because it was really kind of about this topic.
Yeah.
What does the Railroad Commission have to do with venting and flaring? And what do they seem to be doing right now when it comes to regulating those emissions?
So the Railroad Commission doesn't look at venting and flaring from a public health perspective. They look at it from the perspective of waste of a natural resource. And so they have a statutory mandate to reduce the waste of oil and natural gas. And so they have rules on the books that ostensibly prohibit flaring, except in cases where it would not be safe to vent. And so a big part of those rules is exceptions to the rules. And so operators can go to the Railroad Commission and ask for a flaring rule exception. And we call those like flaring permits. And what we have found in looking at the permit database and the violations and all of that is that the Railroad Commission approves pretty much every permit that operators request. In the data that we looked at, we found only 32 times that the Railroad Commission had rejected flaring permits. And then within the same year, the same operator on the same lease at 20 of those sites got a flaring permit anyway. And so it's just very easy to get in the door and not follow the rules by getting a flaring rule exception with the Railroad Commission. And then when it comes to enforcement actions, we've only seen the Railroad Commission penalize operators 11 times and issue a fine 11 times for violating venting and flaring rules. And those violations were never for operators exceeding the duration or the total volumes of gas allowed in their flaring permits. And so we can see that the Railroad Commission doesn't have a good way to enforce those flaring limits. They're just kind of pushing paper here. They're giving people a piece of paper saying that they have a permit. They're fining people if they don't submit a permit application on time, but they're not actually out there making sure that the operators are restricting the amount that they're venting and flaring. Most of the time, too, we see that the railroad commissioners are issuing permits that allow way more gas to be vented and flared than the operators even need to vent or flare. And so we can imagine a situation where an operator asks for a flaring volume that's 10 times what they actually need, and then the Railroad Commission comes back and negotiates for a lower amount, but that amount is still 5 times what the operator actually needs to vent and flare. And so the operator is always going to be in compliance, and they're never going to actually have to change their behavior and prevent these emissions.
So right now, I know Commission Shift has been pretty active on this topic of venting and flaring. Our organizing team has been up to some things about that. Can you speak to what we've been working on in the last couple months?
Yeah, we've been doing some outreach in communities that have high rates of venting and flaring. We were just at a county fair in one of the higher flaring counties in Texas, and we met people that live next to high rates of flaring that have experienced some of these symptoms we're talking about, like cancer and preterm birth. I met one person who lives right next to a flare, and they told me that the fumes kind of like come into the house, and then sometimes they have like phlegm in their throat, or they're coughing, or they can't like breathe as easily as they would normally. And so it's a real nuisance to live with that, but it's also not healthy, and it can be dangerous for their health to live around that kind of pollution.
So coming up, there is I think we're actually in it. The Railroad Commission is taking public comments on their monitoring and enforcement plan. I think venting and flaring is one of the topics that we write about in the comments that Commissionship is going to submit to the Railroad Commission. And folks can sign on to our public letter to send their own comments to the Railroad Commission about this topic. So again, if you follow us and receive Commissionship's newsletter, there will be an opportunity to sign on and submit comments to get on the record about strengthening venting and flaring rules. So that we aren't seeing the abuse of the rule that Virginia was just describing. I also want to flag that there's a website that we've worked on with some of our allies called texasflaringproject.org. And people can explore that website and see some of the flaring volumes in their county. So you can search by Texas County and see the volumes of flaring that's been permitted versus what operators report they're doing, and then versus satellite um, evidence of what's going on in that county. So there's some interesting differences across those measurements. And there's also a form there to sign up for updates if you want to get more involved in flaring outreach or, um, connecting with us about if you want to have a community meeting in your area about flaring. So we'll share that website link as well. The last person who gave public input today was West Texas rancher Skylar White, who has hundreds of legacy wells on his property. And he was back to talk about a leaking well that has been ongoing on his land since December when he first reported it. And now we're at the end of March. He was at the last open meeting talking about this same well, and he came back today asking what will it take to get any action. There is an active operator on file, um, and they obviously, aren't doing what they should do to stop a well from leaking. And Skylar also looked up sort of the history of this operator, saw that they have a long list of non-compliance and problems in the past. So they have a history, they have a record. Um, the question that I left this open meeting with is why has there been no action against this operator? Like, why hasn't the Railroad Commission done anything to make this operator plug or clean up this leak?
One of the unfortunate things about the way the Railroad Commission processes violations and enforcement actions is that it can issue a violation to an operator and then it gives the operator time to come into compliance. And if they don't come into compliance, then the agency issues an enforcement action that usually comes with a penalty or something else the operator has to do. And so it's possible that they're considering themselves to be within this like violation period where they're waiting for the operator to come into compliance. But if there's a situation with a leaking well, that represents imminent danger, right? And imminent risks to groundwater quality. And so that's a situation where the Railroad Commission should be acting immediately and requiring the operator to do something as soon as possible. One option the Railroad Commission has is to go ahead and plug the well themselves and then go to the operator and ask the operator to pay them back. So that's a possibility there. If an operator is really not paying attention, they're not responding to a notice of violation, they're not responding to an enforcement action or any of that, the Railroad Commission has the authority to seal and sever the well and prevent the operator from operating. And usually when they do that, they seal and sever all the wells that the operator has, not just the one that's leaking. And so it can really hit operators hard. It's a pretty good tool in the toolbox that the Railroad Commission has, but the Railroad Commission staff needs to get serious with this operator and let them know that they're getting ready to take action. Otherwise, the operator might keep taking advantage of weak enforcement.
So I feel like the theme of today's debrief is low bars, slaps on the wrist, and delayed action. Unfortunately, that seems to be the through line of all these agenda items. So if anyone does have questions, we're happy to answer them, and you can leave them in the chat. If you're watching on our Facebook Live, you can comment on the Facebook chat, and we can get back to you after this call too. Our website has a ton of great information, commissionship.org, and you can also sign up for our free monthly newsletter there, and that hits your inbox usually at the end of every month. We try to give recaps of open meetings, actions you can take, and all kinds of oil and gas news here in Texas. All right, Virginia, is there anything else from the open meeting today that you want to cover?
I think, did we already say that the deadline for commenting on the monitoring and enforcement plan is April 16th at 5 p.m.? I guess one good thing to note is that there's now an email address you can submit comments to. In the past, there was a form that they made you fill out and it was character limited, so you had to give a really brief note, but now there's an email address you can send stuff to, makes it a lot easier. And
And we have our sign up form, so you
we do have
can.
a sign-on petition. We
Mhm.
also really encourage people, if you've been impacted by an oil and gas issue, if you've ever had to go through the complaints process or an investigation with the Railroad Commission, please comment on the monitoring and enforcement plan, give feedback on what they could have done better. We are increasingly seeing the Railroad Commission accept our suggestions on the monitoring and enforcement plan, so your time will not be wasted in drafting comments. There are staff at the Railroad Commission that really want to make sure that the public's concerns are incorporated and are making the agency better. And so, really just encouraging people to share their stories in their comments.
April 16th deadline. It's a good date to remember. Thanks, Virginia. All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this debrief. The next Railroad Commission open meeting is Tuesday, April 14th. So we'll be back live tweeting that and doing another conversation like this one, going over that open meeting. Thank you.